Picture this: spring 1854. A remote Army post on the edge of the known world, Fort Humboldt, Northern California, about as far from glory as a soldier could physically stand on American soil. A 31-year-old officer walks into his commander's office and quietly resigns his commission. No outburst, no dramatic farewell, no manifesto scrawled in a fit of wounded pride. He was broke. He'd been drinking himself numb for months, mostly out of loneliness and boredom, separated from a wife and children he barely got to see. His commanding officer had made it simple for him: resign or be dragged through a court-martial. So he picked the quiet exit. He packed up what little he owned and vanished into civilian obscurity. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Here is the part that should stop you cold. 8 years later, that same man would be recognized as the single most consequential military mind the North American continent had ever produced. 8 years. Between the disgraced officer sneaking out of a forgotten fort and the general who systematically dismantled the Confederacy from the inside out, there is one of the strangest, most improbable gaps in all of American biography. It doesn't compute on paper. It shouldn't work as a story. And yet it happened exactly this way. The Civil War didn't redeem Ulysses Grant. That's too small a claim, too tidy. What the war actually did was crack him open and expose something that his entire prior existence had kept buried under layers of failure, drink, and disappointment. And once you understand what that something was, the entire arc of the war starts to look less like chaos and more like a machine slowly, inevitably assembling the one man capable of finishing it. So the real question was never simply, how did he win? The real question, the one worth sitting with, is this: what kind of man wins a war the way Grant won his? And why did that particular war seem almost engineered, cell by cell, to produce him? Grant's origin story has none of the mythology you'd expect from a future war hero. Born in 1822 in the small town of Point Pleasant, Ohio, he was the son of a tanner, a man who steered his boy toward West Point, not out of some burning vision of martial destiny, but because it was free. That's it. That's the whole motivation. Young Grant, for his part, had zero appetite for military life. He later admitted he'd half-hoped Congress would simply abolish the academy before he had to finish his education there. He graduated in 1843, sitting at 21st out of 39 cadets. Respectable, forgettable, exactly the kind of middling record that gets a young man shipped off to the infantry to go wherever bodies were needed. He ended up in Mexico, serving under two commanders who couldn't have been more different in temperament. Zachary Taylor, blunt and instinctive, willing to move forward on incomplete information, and Winfield Scott, meticulous, a master of logistics who could push an army deep into hostile territory and keep it fed and armed the whole way. Grant watched both of them work. He absorbed lessons from each style without fully committing to either. He would later call the Mexican War one of the most unjust conflicts his country ever waged. His own words, not some modern reassessment layered on after the fact. But that moral discomfort never stopped him from soaking up every operational lesson the war had to teach. Somewhere behind those famously flat, unreadable eyes, he was quietly filing all of it away for later. Then came the crushing monotony of peacetime service. Distant postings, long separations from his wife, Julia. The isolation ate at him, and the drinking followed. When he finally left the Army, civilian life offered him nothing but more failure. He tried farming and lost. He tried real estate in St. Louis and lost again. By 1860, at 38 years old, he was clerking in his own father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, a job handed to him purely out of family obligation because nobody else would have hired him. 2 decades of adult life, and he had essentially nothing to show for it. When war finally broke out in 1861, Grant didn't come roaring back into uniform on a wave of patriotic fervor. He helped organize Illinois volunteer regiments because he understood paperwork and logistics, and frankly, because there was nothing else productive for him to do with his days. He drilled recruits. He wrote letter after letter to the War Department offering his services. Most of them were never even answered. Eventually, almost by bureaucratic accident rather than any grand design, he was handed a colonelcy over the 21st Illinois. Nothing about that resume foreshadows a legend. Nothing about it should have produced the man who would end up crushing the Confederacy. But here's the thing that anyone who studies Grant closely eventually discovers, and it's almost eerie once you notice it. The man appears to have been nearly incapable of panic. Not incompetent under pressure, the opposite. Wildly, almost unnaturally composed, in a war against an enemy where that single trait turned out to be worth more than raw genius. To be clear, this isn't a case of composure substituting for skill. Grant was deeply, provably competent as a strategist and organizer. But composure was the bedrock everything else got built on top of. And when you look at the Confederate high command sitting across from him, you start to see just how rare that bedrock actually was. Braxton Bragg alienated every single subordinate who ever served under him. Joseph Johnston retreated with such metronomic reliability that Jefferson Davis eventually stopped trusting him with entire armies. P.G.T. Beauregard could flash brilliance in short, dazzling bursts, but couldn't sustain it over a long campaign. Even Robert E. Lee, a man who genuinely never cracked under battlefield pressure, commanded an army that was chronically starved of men, food, and ammunition, and was hemorrhaging irreplaceable officers at a rate no single victory could ever offset. The Confederacy was never short on courage. What it was desperately short on was margin. And courage without margin eventually, inevitably, runs dry. Grant understood margin the way a man who has genuinely gone without money understands money, not as an abstract concept in a ledger, but as something felt in the bone, something learned through years of watching every venture collapse around him. Grant's first serious trial by fire came at Fort Donelson in February 1862, a battle most people outside Tennessee barely remember today, yet one that blew the entire Western Confederate defensive line wide open. His superior, Henry Halleck, gave him grudging permission to move on the fort, then promptly lost contact with him for days on end, sitting anxiously back in St. Louis while Grant methodically encircled the position on the ground. On February 15th, the Confederate garrison launched a desperate breakout attempt and very nearly punched clean through the Union lines. Panic rippled through Grant's subordinates. Most of them reported the situation as an unfolding disaster. Grant rode straight to the front to see for himself rather than trusting the fear in other men's voices, and he noticed something everyone else had completely missed. The Confederate soldiers pouring through the gap were carrying 3 days' worth of rations on their backs. They weren't attacking. They were running. This was an escape attempt, not an offensive. He immediately ordered a counter-assault against the now weakened Confederate lines on the opposite side of the perimeter. By the next morning, the fort's commander was asking for terms of surrender. Grant's response became one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. Overnight, the country crowned him a hero and gave him a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life, Unconditional Surrender Grant, as though he'd been born with it. But Donelson was only the opening chapter. 6 weeks later came Shiloh, and Shiloh very nearly ended him. April 6, 1862. The first day of Shiloh was an outright catastrophe. Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston smashed into the Union encampment along the Tennessee River before Grant had positioned his men or himself for the fight. Entire units dissolved in the chaos. Terrified soldiers fled to the riverbank and simply refused to move another step. The casualty numbers were staggering. Late that night, a staff officer found Grant standing alone in the pouring rain beneath a tree. He'd injured his ankle days earlier and physically couldn't take shelter inside a tent. The officer asked him, point blank, whether the army should retreat. Grant chewed on his cigar for a long moment and gave an answer that has echoed through history ever since. He figured they'd lick them tomorrow. That was it. No elaboration, no reassurance, no speech. Just quiet, stubborn certainty. The next morning, reinforced by Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, Grant counterattacked and drove the Confederates entirely off the field. But the North's reaction wasn't relief. It was outrage. The first day's casualty numbers were so horrifying that newspapers openly called for Grant's head. Halleck, the same man who'd been unreachable by telegraph for the entirety of the Donelson campaign, now showed up in person and quietly demoted Grant into a powerless supervisory role. For several agonizing weeks that spring, Grant seriously considered resigning again. Not out of disgrace this time, but out of pure humiliation, watching from the sidelines as a man he privately considered his inferior fumbled a campaign he could see clearly needed to be run differently. Abraham Lincoln refused to let him go. When pressed on why he was sticking with a general so many people wanted gone, Lincoln gave an answer that has been repeated so often it's almost lost its weight. He couldn't spare this man. He fights. That sentence deserves far more credit than it usually gets. Lincoln had spent a full year surrounded by generals who could organize beautifully, communicate brilliantly, and maneuver with exquisite caution, and still somehow never actually finish anything. There was George McClellan, who built the Army of the Potomac into a magnificent fighting machine, and then treated every Confederate force he ever encountered as though it were twice its real size. There was John Pope, all bluster, crushed at Second Bull Run. There was Ambrose Burnside, who ordered the single most futile frontal assault of the entire war at Fredericksburg and watched 13,000 men fall in a single afternoon for absolutely nothing gained. What Lincoln needed wasn't a general who could brilliantly explain why victory was difficult. He needed one who would simply find a way to win anyway. Before we get into the moment that proved him beyond any doubt, if you're finding this story as wild as I do, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it means more stories like this one land in your feed. All right, back to it. Vicksburg is where Grant put that question to rest for good. The city sat high on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, heavily fortified, having already repelled 2 separate Union naval assaults. Whoever held Vicksburg controlled the river at its single most critical choke point. Without it, the Union could never fully use the Mississippi, could never truly split the Confederacy in two, could never finish what the Donelson Campaign had started out west. Through the winter of 1862 into 1863, Grant tried approach after approach that simply didn't work. Failed canal projects, bayou routes cutting through the Louisiana swamps, overland pushes that bogged down helplessly in mud. Every single failure was gleefully reported in the northern press as fresh evidence of his incompetence. What nobody credited him for at the time was that each failed attempt was systematically eliminating options and teaching him something true about the terrain and the enemy he was facing. He was a man who tested ground with his own boots, rather than theorizing about it safely from a map table. By April 1863, Grant had settled on a plan so audacious that his own subordinates thought it bordered on madness. He would march his entire army down the Louisiana side of the river, cross well below Vicksburg, deliberately cut himself off from his supply lines, live directly off the Mississippi countryside, and swing up behind the city from the south and east. William Tecumseh Sherman, his single most trusted subordinate, wrote a formal letter objecting to the whole scheme. Grant read it, acknowledged it, and moved forward anyway. In just 17 days, Grant's army marched an astonishing 180 miles, won 5 separate engagements along the way, inflicted roughly 8,000 Confederate casualties while absorbing fewer than 5,000 of his own, and placed the city of Vicksburg under full siege. The city surrendered on July 4, 1863, the very same day Robert E. Lee's battered army was limping away from Gettysburg, and 30,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms in a single stroke. The Mississippi River now belonged to the Union from its source all the way to the Gulf. The Confederacy had been physically severed in two. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, sat down and personally wrote Grant a letter admitting he had originally doubted the entire Vicksburg plan. For a sitting president to put that kind of admission on paper was extraordinary. Grant had been right, and Lincoln told him so, directly and in writing. What made Vicksburg so devastatingly effective wasn't tactical brilliance in the classic sense. None of the choreographed, almost balletic maneuver warfare that made Napoleon's campaigns legendary, where timing and terrain had to align with near-perfect precision. Grant's operational design was undeniably bold, but the execution underneath it was relentlessly, almost brutally, practical. He kept his corps commanders moving at all times. When John McClernand, a political general chasing personal glory, showed up with an exaggerated report of a minor skirmish and tried to leverage it into an independent command, Grant relieved him on the spot. The kind of ruthless personnel decision most Union commanders avoided entirely, because it meant fighting Washington politics on top of fighting the actual enemy. Grant thought in terms of weight, attrition, and unbroken pressure, rather than elegance. He wanted his enemy to never get a moment's rest, never find a quiet sector to regroup and rebuild in. When Lincoln brought him east in March 1864 and gave him command of all Union armies, Grant expanded that same philosophy to its fullest, most terrifying scale. He refused to fight Lee on Lee's terms, refused to get lured into Virginia's tangled, defensible terrain, where Confederate skill could neutralize the North's numerical advantage. Instead, he decided to fight Lee everywhere, simultaneously, without any pause for either side to catch its breath. While Grant personally hammered away at Lee in the brutal Overland Campaign, Sherman would tear a scorched path through Georgia. Philip Sheridan would strip the Shenandoah Valley down to bare, unusable earth. George Thomas would crush what remained of Confederate power in the West at Nashville. There would be no quiet corner left anywhere in the Confederacy to regroup in. The human cost of the Overland Campaign was staggering. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. The casualty lists shocked the Northern public in ways that even Shiloh hadn't managed, because this killing was so concentrated, so relentless, so seemingly without let-up. The press and members of Congress branded Grant a butcher, and the accusation had enough grim arithmetic behind it to actually land. Thousands of men died in a single assault at Cold Harbor that Grant himself later admitted. In writing, he regretted ordering. The criticism wasn't baseless, but the full picture requires looking at the other side of the ledger too. Lee's army was bleeding out from a population base already stretched far past its breaking point, and those losses couldn't be replaced the way Grant's could. Confederate desertion accelerated by the week. The Southern Railroad network, the very system that had allowed Confederate armies to shift rapidly between theaters for the entire war, was being systematically torn apart behind the front lines. The siege at Petersburg, stretching from June 1864 all the way into April 1865, wasn't a stalemate in any real sense. It was a slow, methodical strangulation that Lee could neither break free of nor survive indefinitely. Grant had him precisely where patience and sustained weight could be applied without any real limit. Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The terms Grant offered were so generous they reportedly caught Lee himself off guard. Confederate soldiers could simply go home. They could keep their horses. They would face no prosecution for treason so long as they obeyed the law going forward. When Union troops began cheering the surrender, Grant reportedly ordered them silenced, on the grounds that the men in gray were their countrymen again, not their enemies. Whatever failures came before the war, and whatever failures would come after it in his presidency, and there were real ones. In that courthouse room, he showed a quality that 4 years of relentless killing had somehow failed to burn out of him. So, why did he win? There's no single, clean answer, because the war itself never had a single, clean shape to it. But stripped all the way down to its core, here's the truth of it. Grant matched the actual nature of the war in front of him, rather than trying to force it into the shape of a war he might have personally preferred to fight. The Civil War wasn't ultimately decided by the most dazzling campaign or the single most perfectly executed battle. It was decided by whichever side could absorb the most punishment, sustain the longest effort, and keep unbroken forward pressure on an enemy that was steadily running out of everything: men, food, rail lines, time. Grant never needed the war to be something other than what it actually was. He looked directly at it, accepted its brutal terms without flinching, and operated inside those terms with a ruthlessness that had almost no theatrical quality to it at all. Just enormous, grinding, practical effect. Think about that image again. The man selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis in 1858, unable to make rent on a hardscrabble farm he'd named, with what reads like dark, self-aware humor. Hardscrabble itself. The man who quietly resigned from the Army in disgrace at 31 years old, with nowhere left to go. That man had already learned something about pure endurance that no military academy on earth could have taught him. He had already learned exactly what it felt like to be losing and to keep moving forward anyway. Not because he expected rescue from anywhere, but because stopping simply wasn't something his constitution would allow. The war didn't transform Ulysses S. Grant into someone new. It finally handed his particular, stubborn, unshakable constitution a problem that was actually worthy of it. If this story hit the way it hit me putting it together, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep making videos like this, and there's a lot more history just as wild as this one still to come. Thanks for watching.